Hello everyone, welcome to my talk titled SYCL-Bench, a versatile cross-platform benchmark suite for heterogeneous computing. My name is Sohan and I am a postdoctoral researcher at Technical University of Berlin. This work is the result of collaboration with Heidelberg University, University of Innsbruck and University of Salerno. The outline of the talk is, first I will talk about the motivation for developing SYCL-Bench. Then I will talk about SYCL-Bench design methodology. In the experimental evaluation, I will show the microbenchmarking results, the comparison of two SYCL implementations and their runtime overhead on two different platforms. Finally, I will draw conclusions. While SYCL is a relatively new programming model with the different implementation reaching official specification in August 2018, there is a growing SYCL ecosystem, including projects such as SYCL Parallel STL, a TensorFlow port to SYCL, as well as four major SYCL implementations shown in the figure. The first open source LLVM SYCL implementation, also known as InterSYCL. The second one is the CodePlays commercial compute CPP. The third one is the TriSYCL, an open source project mainly funded by Xilinx. The fourth one is the HipSYCL, an open source implementation led by Heidelberg University, which is also collaborated for this work. Together, these four implementations allow a SYCL program to target any CPU, GPUs from at least two vendors and FPGAs from two vendors. So if we look at the available SYCL implementations and target platforms, then a programmer has a choice. Then the question is how to choose a SYCL implementation and how do different SYCL implementation perform for a given hardware and given code. So let's look at the further motivation for this work. SYCL is a high-level single-source programming model that relies heavily on implicit behavior. SYCL implementation use different optimizations and patterns that are efficient in one implementation may not be in another. In addition, performance implications are not consistently documented. Furthermore, regular tasks such as scheduling, data management are handled implicitly by the SYCL runtime, therefore increasing productivity. While SYCL runtime may automatically perform optimizations such as overlapping data transfer and kernel executions, it is not apparent whether any particular implementation actually employs such optimizations for a given code pattern. So again, there are questions that we would like to get answered. For example, will my SYCL implementation overlap compute and data transfers? Will my SYCL implementation recognize that data transfers are unnecessary in a certain case? What is the runtime overhead of different SYCL implementations? To address this, we need a benchmark suite. So we present SYCL-Bench, a versatile benchmark suite written in SYCL. The main goal of SYCL-Bench is to evaluate the performance of both devices and different SYCL implementations. So let's first look at the SYCL-Bench design methodology. There are three categories to accomplish different goals. The first category is the micro benchmarks, a set of architectural micro benchmarks with different patterns stressing different hardware subsystems, for example, arithmetic or the memory subsystem. They have been designed to emphasize performance characterizations on GPU devices. The second category, we have applications or kernels. These are real-world applications from different domains such as linear algebra. The main goal of this category is to test the performance of different devices and SYCL implementation for real-world code patterns. In the third category, we have SYCL runtime benchmarks. These benchmarks are designed to stress the SYCL runtime. This category includes multiple kernels that can generate different task graph and stress different aspects of the SYCL runtime. In total, in SYCL-Bench, we have 62 codes that can be used for hardware characterizations and 9 codes to evaluate SYCL-specific runtime. The benchmark suite is open source, So if you are interested, please clone and give it a try. And if there are any questions, please reach us. Furthermore, I would like to stress that SYCL-Bench is just not a collection of benchmarks. It is a benchmarking framework for easy extension. For example, there are common command line arguments. A programmer does not need to rewrite the timing code again and again. There is an automated executions with the test profiles to support reproducibility of results and etc. etc. So let's look at the experimental evaluations. We use two platforms. The first one is the Intel Xeon CPU, and second one is the GPU from NVIDIA Titan X. For software, we run our experiment on Ubuntu 16. We use HipSYCL with Clang 9, LLVM 9, and CUDA 10.1. For Compute CPP, we have 1.3 version, Intel OpenCL 2.0, CUDA 10.1. And our goal is to support all SYCL implementation. However, in this paper, we evaluated two SYCL implementation, Compute CPP with PTX and Spear backends, HipSYCL with CPU, CUDA, and ROCm backends. So let's look at the results. First, we look at the micro benchmarking on NVIDIA Titan X. We present 5 distinct micro benchmarks designed to quantitatively evaluate various device performance characteristics through the lens of SYCL. First, couple of notes. There are some missing bars. That means some runs did not produce correct results because of the experimental PTX backend in Compute CPP. For example, couple of bars missing in host device bandwidth micro benchmark. Second, the Compute CPP performance is split into 2 bars. The gray bar indicates the performance using kernel-only execution time, while the blue bar shows the performance using overall execution time. This was done to deal with an unexpected bug that we found in Compute CPP PTX. Please read the paper for more detail. The HipSYCL performance is always based on the overall execution time. So now let's look at the 5 micro benchmarks. The first one, the DRAM, which measures the achievable device memory bandwidth by copying single and double precision floating point values between 2 buffers. It can also measure the performance for 2D and 3-dimensional buffer, thus indirectly quantifying how efficient a mapping of high dimensional indices to the underlying hardware is for a given SYCL implementations. The host to device bandwidth measures the transfer between the host and device memory. The local memory bandwidth is similar in spirit. The arithmetic and the SF benchmarks basically exercise the device main arithmetic units and special function units. As these are bandwidth and throughput results, the higher is better. Except the local memory benchmark, where both HipSYCL and Compute CPP shows similar results. Mostly Compute CPP performance is worse compared to HipSYCL, and we think this is primarily due to the experimental PTX backend, which is not fully matured. So let's now look at the Compute CPP versus HipSYCL on Intel Xeon. Figure shows that the Compute CPP implementation outperforms HipSYCL implementation for most of the benchmarks. These benchmarks are from the applications of the kernel category. The main reason for the higher execution time for the HipSYCL is that some benchmarks use ND range parallel for example, the LRC and SP ND benchmarks, and ND parallel for cannot be efficiently implemented by library-based implementation such as SYCL without a dedicated compiler support. Moreover, the basic parallel for and the hierarchical parallel for in HipSYCL have higher runtime overheads for CPU, which we will see later. Compute CPP on average is 4.5 times faster than HipSYCL. This figure shows the Compute CPP versus HipSYCL on NVIDIA Titan X. Figure shows that HipSYCL outperforms the Compute CPP on GPU. On average, HipSYCL is like 2.7x faster than the Compute CPP, and we think that the Compute CPP performance is limited again due to the experimental PTX backend. Now let's talk about the SYCL runtime benchmarking. We use two benchmarks to stress a SYCL runtime. Each benchmark has many kernels that generate different tasks, which we use to stress the different aspects of the SYCL runtime. In the first benchmark called sequential task, we submit many simple kernels. All kernels, all kernels require read-write access to the same buffer. Therefore, SYCL implementation needs to execute them sequentially. In the second benchmark called independent task, we again submit many kernels, but this time all kernels require a read-write access to different buffers. Therefore, SYCL implementation can execute them simultaneously. As the kernels are very simple and trivial as incrementing a counter, most of the execution time can be attributed to SYCL runtime, such as scheduling latency, etc. So let's look at the SYCL runtime overhead on GPU by using sequential tasks. We see that for sequential tasks, both implementations show similar behavior for four different kernel invocation mechanisms, which are single task, basic parallel for, hierarchical parallel for, and ND range parallel for. If we look at the runtime overhead on GPU using independent task, then we see that compute CPP stack exhibits a higher runtime overhead compared to the HIP-SYCL implementation. Moreover, the gap is proportional to the number of submitted tasks, which means that the compute CPP has a higher average latency per submitted kernel. The performance gap can be explained by lower scheduling overhead in HIP-SYCL. So let's look at the SYCL runtime overhead on CPU using independent task. What we see that compute CPP has a lower overhead than HIP-SYCL. There are a couple of reasons. First, kernel execution mechanism is different in HIP-SYCL and compute CPP on CPU. HIP-SYCL uses OpenMP, and while compute CPP uses OpenCL. So basic parallel for and hierarchical parallel for in HIP-SYCL are likely slower due to the OpenMP threads. Please note that the HIP-SYCL single task does not go through OpenMP threads. In summary, we presented SYCL-Bench, the first open source benchmark suite written in and for SYCL. We experimentally demonstrated the effectiveness of SYCL-Bench by performing device characterization and evaluating efficiency of HIP-SYCL and compute CPP implementations. HIP-SYCL outperformed compute CPP on average by 2.7x on Titan X, and compute CPP was 4.5 times faster than HIP-SYCL on Intel Xeon. While compute CPP performance on Titan X is primarily hampered by the experimental backend, HIP-SYCL CPU performance is much lower because of API construct that cannot be implemented efficiently without a dedicated compiler. In the end, I would like to thank D4G and EPSRC for funding these results. Thank you very much for listening. I would like to answer your question if you have any. Thank you very much.